Over time, I've learned that there are three types of contexts that you'll start to work with and you'll start to build into your OmniFocus system. And the one that we think of the most are these active style of contexts, the ones that we typically mention quite a bit. Some people go with hardware, some people go with energy levels, there's software sometimes, times of the day. You'll run into these quite a bit. But there are more than just these active types of contexts. And there's primarily two other types that we'll get into. But I want to talk about these active types first. So as you can see here, I've got active, meta, and placeholders. So we'll get to meta and placeholders here shortly. I want to talk about these active contexts. And these are the ones, like I mentioned, that we think about the most often. So MacBook Pro, if you go with the hardware route, if you want to go into kind of an energy level, what it takes to accomplish a specific task, you'll get into things like big rocks. Sometimes people use short dashes or the energy levels, or sometimes people use times of day. That's where the after hours piece can come in. So ultimately what these are is they're active working contexts. So they become a list of things that you can do whenever you're in that context. And I'd recommend to people that you try to keep this as small as you can. Try to keep this around the 7 to 10 range. And I say that because if you get too many or you start nesting them and it starts to get complex, you start to get a little bit wary on which one do you choose and how do you assign them and how do they operate in the way that you want. And it gets to be too much and it gets to be too tricky and it gets there very quickly. So I try to limit those as much as I can. The general rule of thumb that I operate off of is that if you have, say, 5 or 6 items on a list, you're good. If you have 1 or 2, you probably need to consolidate that context into another one and try to limit and consolidate what you have. But if you have a context that has like 40 or 50 items on it, that can easily get to be too overwhelming and it's too difficult to decide what to work on. You're trying to summarize too much or consolidate it too far. So you need to break that off. So the general rule of thumb, I try to make sure that they have at least 4 or 5, but on average, most of mine have around 10 to 12 items on each one. So that's my active lists, and that's where I would recommend that you start as well. Now, if we go down to the meta level, this is where you want to try to keep this down as 1, maybe 2 contexts that are going to work here, because ultimately what these are contexts that help you work on the system itself. I'll see this named admin. You'll see that one quite a bit. Some people call it OmniFocus simply because it's you're working on the system itself. I also see sharpen saw quite a bit, where it's me working on myself, working on the system, that type of scenario where you're working on the thing itself, the system that helps you to get things done. And ultimately, for me, I operate off of just one of these. For me, I use horizons. And ultimately, all that is a collection of the tasks that sit in the Horizons projects. So it's my Horizon 3, 4, and 5 level goals and missions that I want to work with. And those are primarily what set my direction for the rest of the system. But ultimately, for a context level, I try to keep it at 1. I could easily see going to 2 if you used Horizons and Admin. The 2 of those, I could see using that. But you really don't want to get too complicated and have too many of these. You want to try to keep it as limited as possible. Outside of Meta, you go down to Placeholders. And I use specifically 3 of these. And I could see using some more of them in other scenarios, but I would, again, try to keep it as limited as you can. That's a running theme with me. Keep it simple and don't overcomplicate it. Don't get too many of something. You don't want to have too many places to look and too many options available to you. But for me, I operate with the 3. Running, which is simply a placeholder context for my someday maybe lists. Checklists follows the checklist, templates follows the templates. I could easily consolidate all of those into one and just call it on hold. There are rare scenarios where I will look at those individually, but honestly, if I think over the last 12 months, I think I've looked at maybe templates and checklists like once or twice over the last 12 months. So it's very rare that I will do that. Ultimately, what these are is they're simply ways to pull things out of the remaining pieces of your system. So that's why these are on hold. I just want them to come out of the active and available working tasks and the list that I'm going to operate off of. So that's why those are on hold, and it's why I want them as what I'm calling a placeholder. Now, ultimately, whenever you start to put all of these together, when you look at all of them, I would end up with, at the complete overall level, I end up with about 12 or 13 contexts in total. And that includes both all of the active, the meta, and the placeholders collectively. And we'll get into what those specific ones are when we go through the examples in another video. But you need to understand the 3 different levels, because some people try to create a meta context and they treat it like they would an active. They treat it as a context that you're somehow going to be in automatically at some point. One, it doesn't work that way. 2, it's a wrong way to think about it, because it's the time when you're going to be working on the system, which is typically during, say, daily or weekly or monthly reviews. That's when you're going to be working on your system, is during those review periods. So I could easily see, call it reviews, whatever you want to call it at that point, but you need to think about it as a meta context. Same thing with the placeholders. Those are not active contexts. They're not usually going to be ones that you're going to work off of. They're simply there to help pull tasks out of the active working lists. So with those 3 in mind, we'll go into some of examples and some different ways of putting these together, how to think about them, and that'll help us to start to put together your actual list of contexts.